Happy Monday. Now, today we're going to try to be a little bit shorter than we were last week. I do hear you all, and that was a lot of information to take in, but let's get into it. Let's not forget that we're coming from the book Black Fortunes. So, let us start. Oops. With Miss Harriet Bell. And Harriet Bell Hayden, 1816 to 1893. She was born into enslavement in Kentucky. She was the second wife of Lewis Hayden. They were the primary operators of the Underground Railroad in Boston, and she assisted John Brown. This is why a lot of Black people today tell white people who cling on to John Brown as this great white hope, this intense savior, as if he was just out there by himself doing all these things, to simmer down. Because let's not forget, last week we learned who was financing all of his riots and all of his freedom work. A Black woman. And a lot of the work, a lot of the lives that he put into jeopardy were Black people. So it's like, yeah, you're helping to save us, but you're also putting us in danger, which still occurs today, where you have white people who are at the very beginning or haven't even truly started their anti-racism journey that are so gung-ho that are like, oh, we don't want your labor, but that's what you're utilizing. That's what you're utilizing. And please, before you decide to step onto the front lines, make sure you educate yourself. But let's continue. Mrs. Hayden passed away in 1893 at the age of 74. She died at home of pneumonia. Now, Charlestown, West Virginia, was founded in 1786 by Charles Washington, the brother of George Washington. In 1863, the courthouse of the city was heavily damaged due to artillery fire of the Civil War and deemed unusable. And I bring this up because within the book, Charlestown is brought up here and there quite a bit. Now, in 1787, the Charlestown Academy for Boys was founded. A few years later, they did create an academy for girls. And you may be wondering, like, Taz, why are you bringing this up? I need you all to understand, as you go through this book and other books, how amazing the feats that women were able to achieve when historically women have been discouraged or not even been provided the tools for education. And when you couple that with being a woman from a marginalized community, and oftentimes when they do offer education to women, it's highly domesticated. It's to teach a woman how to care for somebody else's family, to care for a household, to prepare themselves to be a wife, to be a mother, as if that is all. And when it comes to Black women specifically, they were more so taught and encouraged to become domestics. And as we go through further literature, even this book, you'll see how women were pushed that way. And just like we discussed last week with one of the women who hid the fact that she was a millionaire, she continued to work her entire life as a domestic because that's what was expected of her. Now, let's discuss slavery in West Virginia. By 1860, 48% went to agriculture, 16% commerce, 21% industry and extraction, 15% mixed occupations. The slave population 1820 was 15,178. 1830, 17,673. 1840, 18,488. 1850, 20,428. 1860, 18,371. Once again, this is why I give the numbers and not the percentages, because somebody will go, but in comparison to the population, this was just 2%, this was just 5%. They give you percentages because it makes it seem like less. It makes it seem like it wasn't such a big deal. It wasn't so widespread. Not so many people own slaves. Every time I hear the argument, not so many people own slaves, that makes it more egregious, not less egregious. When you think about a quote unquote handful of people in perspective to the population, owned hundreds of people, owned thousands of people. The equivalent of a corporation today, these people had ownership of them. They were making nothing but profit. They were paying zero labor costs. And before you go, but they clothed them, did they? Or were enslaved people making their own clothes or repairing scraps that were about to be thrown away? But they were feeding them, were they? When you take these plantation tours, when you look up plantations, have you never noticed how many of them had kitchens on the outside of the homes? Who did you think was cooking the food? This is why the whole notion of Black people wanting retaliation is moot. When you're the one breastfeeding and taking care of children, taking care of the elderly and the sick and the invalid, and preparing the food, you could have taken out an entire race of people. Why do you think dictators and aristocracy have food tasters and all of these safeguards? Let's be real. Let's continue. Now, in 1850, the peak of slavery within West Virginia, 7%. And I'm about to give you a comparison. 7% of the population was slaves. That 7% equaled out to 20,428 people. Let me repeat that for you. At the peak of slavery in West Virginia, 7% of the population, which equated to 20,428 people. From 1840 to 1860, the slave population tripled due to the growth of cotton and tobacco production. Cherokee lands in Alabama and Georgia also opened up. Now, if we're going to talk about slavery in West Virginia, it's only fair and appropriate to also discuss anti slavery within West Virginia. There was no official organized movement in West Virginia. And this also goes into when people go, well, my family, they didn't have slaves. We didn't have a hand in slavery, but your family also wasn't anti racist. Your family was also not anti slavery. Your family just went with the status quo, which is no better. There were a few abolitionists, and resistance was mostly due to economic principles or religious affiliations, not because personally people were like, this is wrong. That's why a lot of times with modern Protestant Christianity, the argument for people holding on so much to their Christianity is one, familial tradition. And two, if you notice, they always say, well, how will you know what's moral? How will you know what's ethical? It goes back historically. They did not oppose slavery. They realized that when they took the tyranny out of their handbook, it was wrong. Now, for some people, their anti-slavery was political in basis. Now, Virginia slave masters used the 3/5 clause to gain unequal representation in the General Assembly and for tax advantages. See, shell companies went from being enslaved people to just businesses on paper. At the end of the day, the wealthy in this country have always tried to skate taxes. Always. And it's funny because they hated paying taxes to the British, then set up a system of taxation that they didn't like, but never really changed it. They just found ways to get around it. Like, how are you at the beginning of a country, developing it, founding it, and realize, you know what, this doesn't really work for me when I hit this amount of money and you don't change it? That's like you setting up a company and then you learning how to defraud your own company. Change the rules. From 1831 to 1832, the General Assembly the Nat Turner Rebellion of 1831 challenged solutions to be explored regarding the growing problems of slavery. And I also need you to keep in mind rebellions such as Nat Turner's rebellion caused a lot of people to go, maybe we should not have slavery. Not because of morality, not because of financial reasons, not because of anything else. They were afraid that they would become casualties of these rebellions. And keep in mind, there is no gravesite for Nat Turner. There are people who probably still have mementos from his body within their family that's being passed down generation to generation to generation. But the vast majority of his body was consumed by those who had a hand in his demise. And yes, the United States, even during its colonial days, has a very long-standing history of one taking egregious, savage trophies from those deemed non-white, and a long-standing history of consuming bodies. That's why a lot of us roll our eyes that cannibalism is on the books as illegal, given how much cannibalism is ingrained in the history of this nation. But some of the proposals to squash slave rebellions were immediate emancipation, which we know that just it looked good and sound good on paper. That's it. Because the only thing that they adopted was the next proposal, gradual emancipation. And as always, as it's always on the table, deportation. Yeah, come on in here, do the work for us. And then when you're done, get out. You're not warranted here. Sound familiar? Because as we keep saying, nothing is new. People have a problem with immigrants and they call them illegal. No, they're documented and undocumented immigrants. But once again, they want to use them for damn near free labor and then kick them back out the country. There are others that propose to keep the status quo and just increase the penalties for any type of fleeing and or rebellions. Now, the anti-slavery within the General Assembly was adjourned without any action ever being taken because nobody wanted to lose money or lose their wealth. And what do you mean? What do I mean? Because some people are like, well, if they lose money, they lose their wealth. No, there were people who, just like today, like Elon Musk, liquidly with cash, he's dirt poor. As far as assets, that's what makes him a billionaire. During the time of chattel slavery, the assets were the enslaved people. That's why they were so butthurt when there were rebellions, when slaves were freed, when slaves escaped. Because those families were losing their wealth. In 1844, the Methodist Church became divided regarding slave ownership. And who was most divided? The ministers, the heads of the churches. North of Lynchburg, ownership was forbidden. And this would have included the vast majority of West Virginia. But most of the parishioners refused to follow. Makes you rethink why so many conservative Christians try to lie and say that the United States is a Christian nation and was founded on Christian views and ideologies. These are their Christian views and ideologies. They tell you to follow God's word, but they believe that God's word wasn't crap when it came to ministers saying, hey, it's wrong to own other people. Slavery is forbidden here. And if you choose to be a congregant, you can't own slaves. But they continued to worship. Just like if you remember last week, there were people on abolitionist boards that still own slaves. In August of 1861, at the Methodist Virginia Conference of the Methodist Church, it was resolved to, and I quote, utterly condemn any attempt to interfere with the legal relation of master and servant. Did you catch that? Let's run that back real quick. It was resolved by the church at a church conference to utterly condemn any attempt to interfere with the legal relation of master and servant. But I thought God made no mistakes. I thought we were all his children. I thought we were all created in his likeness. I thought through Christianity, equality was the standard. But instead of making it okay to save thine fellow man, but keep in mind, 3/5 was also the law of the land. There was also a similar split with the Baptist church. And see, I've said this for years, the umbrella that is the Protestant church, you have all these different denominations because they nitpick what part of the Bible they want to highlight. And it's like, oh, you're not comfortable with all the rules and regulations of being Methodist? That's okay. I'll come over here and be Baptist. Oh, well, I like being Baptist, but I don't like all this. Okay, well, I'll be Southern Baptist. Okay, you be Southern Baptist. I'm going to be First Baptist. Oh, wait a minute. I don't like that. So I'm going to be Lutheran so that I can have. Not so much one sound, one band, huh? Hmm. Now, in 1847, Henry Ruffner, a slave owner and the son of a slave owner, published a pamphlet called An Address to the People of West Virginia, also known as the Ruffner pamphlet. The result of his speech, which was the result of his speech at the Franklin Society in Lexington. This was his attempt to advocate for the end of slavery for economic and social reasons. Isn't it funny? All these good Christian folks, all these, we came to establish these colonies and eventually this country because we could not practice our religion the way that we wanted to over there. Religion, 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 God, God, God. But the vast majority of the decisions that shaped this country were financial and societal. So when you mix finances with societal perception under standards that you create, you get a lot of Stepford activity. We need to look like Patty Perfect in public. His claim was that slavery decreased growth and development. He wasn't wrong. He wasn't wrong. This is why, even though the Daughters of the Confederacy fought hard to teach the Civil War as the War of Northern Aggression, and you hear people going, the South will rise again. The South never rose. The South decimated itself because the skills laid within the slaves, not the slave masters. Hear that. The skills lied within the slaves, not the slave masters. Now, I want you to think back to all of the inventions that have been accredited to white people during the antebellum period. I want you to think long and hard about where the information that was put into the educational system during the antebellum period. Because if white people, especially slave masters, were so intellectually beyond everyone and had all of these skill sets, shouldn't those former enslavers be leaps and bounds above everyone else? Shouldn't current day CEOs and those that are benefactors of generational wealth be far beyond everyone else? In the 1840s, the Liberty Party, the new abolitionists, tried to garner members. And basically, what happened was they created violent pro slavery reactions. A nation that propagandized itself as a great Christian nation always has historically violent reactions to non-white people being free to move about and live as they desire. From 1840 to the 1850s, most notably, there were a ton of mobs against abolitionists in Virginia and in West Virginia. And a lot of abolitionists from Virginia would infiltrate West Virginia just to keep them in check regarding their rhetoric about ending slavery. Because nothing says, screw you, like leaving your yard to go into somebody else's yard to tell them what to do. Very United States, isn't it? Oops. Now let's discuss Mr. James K. Polk. Now, from 1845 to 1849, as a Democrat, he served as president. He was closely associated with Manifest Destiny. Now, keep in mind, this is before the party change. He presided over a time of great territorial expansion. He annexed Texas early in his tenure and obtained 500,000 square miles of territory, including California, from Mexico through the Mexican American War. This is why people laugh when certain United States residents have an issue with Mexican people, saying that they come from a long line of indigenous people from this area, etc. The United States has an incredible, infamous history of turning either whole countries into states or portions of countries into portions of states. Now, Polk did not run for re-election. He did achieve all of his major domestic and foreign goals. Well, everybody is touting Biden for what he's ticked off of his checklist for goals. It seems like the more tyrannical a goal is, back in the day, it was a whole lot easier to achieve those. He did fail to understand the depths of popular emotion regarding the westward expansion of slavery. And before you go, but it wasn't like Black people were out here voting during 1845 to 1849. No, but there were a lot of poor white people who needed to earn a living and needed to acquire skills so that they could climb the proverbial ladder for themselves and not have generational poverty. See, we focus and we talk a lot about generational wealth, but we avoid the conversation of generational poverty. If you do not have the ability to gain proper education and proper skill sets, what is passed down? And how are you going to have the stockpile of cash in order to even educate your children? Because even if you start a family business, the best way to increase profitability is to utilize your family as either low cost or no cost laborers. So there were poor white people who needed slavery to stay on one side of the country so that they could expand. so they could obtain some wealth or even just a comfortable level of living. This is also a prime example of what we mean when we say white supremacy and racism does not just affect those that you hate because of the color of their skin. There will be casualties of your own skin folk. And they know that there's going to be casualties of their own skin folk, hence the fact that you have all these talking points to push people into hating other marginalized communities. It's not that you're poor because we're sucking everything out of you also. You're poor because the immigrants are coming in. You can't get this because we got to give it to the black people. See, they want you to hate the people that they know they can underpay, because when you go from not paying anybody anything to paying them a couple dollars a week, that's more than they ever had. So they're going to be happy with that. Plus, they have no reference. It's just like when you got your first job. You didn't know if the pay was good or if the pay was crap. And now let's discuss short version, because I could probably do like a 6-part series on this, but I'm gonna do my best to cliff note it as much as possible. Manifest destiny. The idea that white Americans were divinely ordained to settle the entire continent of North America. Not just the United States, the entire continent of North America, Canada and Mexico. And keep in mind, this is why I say United States resident, because to be an American, Canadians are American, Mexicans are American. Think about that. And once again, see how they pull their religion in, their God, their deity, pulling it in so that they can have their way. Because it is stemming from that tyrannical Christianity that fostered and festered and grew like weeds in the wind in the United States, that equates blessings and God's favor to materialism. That's why you really don't hear too much about prosperity churches outside of the United States. That's why the United States exports so many missionaries to save the world, because they're looking at places who choose to stay in closer touch with their heritage, because they are able to be fruitful and how they deem fruitfulness. But in the United States, everything is like, oh, they're poor, they're destitute because they don't have this, that they don't have that. We got to give it to them. But notice how they always go out of the country to save the black and brown and not save anybody. I digress. Now, this was inspired by a variety of ways to destroy and remove the native populations of the land. Most closely associated with President Polk, it inflamed tensions regarding slavery, and it was also part of the lead up to the Civil War. In 1845, the phrase manifest destiny was coined by newspaper editor John Sullivan. He described the ideology of continental expansion with the term manifest destiny. But the idea far predates the term. Before they had the term manifest destiny, there were a lot of different ways people described it, but the sentiment was all the same, that it was God's decision that the white man was to have all the land on the continent that he should desire, that he should desire. Hmm. Now let's discuss George Washington Freeman, 1789 to 1858. He was an Episcopal clergyman, yet another branch of this umbrella. From 1844 to 1858, he was the second missionary bishop of the Episcopal Diocese of Arkansas. And he was the first bishop to live in the state. Really breaks up yet again that notion that the United States was founded on Christianity when you had whole colonies that His jurisdiction included and this is just what it was called, the Indian Territory, which is now present day Oklahoma, and the Episcopal missions within the Republic of Texas. His father was a strict Congregationalist pastor known as Reverend Nathaniel Freeman. In 1818, George married Anne Yates. He was a fervent Puritan that was against worldly pleasures. And I know y'all have run across some people that are like this, generally under the sub umbrella that has its own umbrella of the Pentecostal church, which he is Episcopal, so it fits. Dancing, whist games, theater, circuses, parties, satin, lace, ribbons, and feathers. Excuse me. This is why he was the bishop from 1844 to 1858, because his views caused him to resign because the rest of the congregation wasn't that strict. Now, these worldly pleasures were considered a sin by him. Let me read the list again. And you tell me what's missing from this list that maybe should have been on the list. There are a couple things that, I don't know, maybe you agree with me, are far more egregious. But here we go. Dancing, whist games, theater, circuses, parties, satin, lace, ribbons, and feathers. No adultery, no touching of children, no slavery no. That seems to be fair game. Now let's discuss Mr. Robert Fulton, November 14th, 1765 to February 24th, 1815. He was a United States inventor and engineer as well as a businessman. He is widely credited, pay attention, widely credited with developing the world's first commercially successful steamboat. That steamboat, the Northern River Steamboat, also known as the Clermont. In 1807, the steamboat traveled the Hudson with passengers from New York City to Albany and back, which equated to approximately 300 nautical miles in the span of 62 hours. This changed river trade and traffic on major American rivers. Prior to his 1808 marriage, he had a variety of polyamorous as well as homosexual relationships. Isn't it funny that the more you dig into history, the more polyamory and homosexuality was just out and about? Nobody cared. Nobody cared. Nobody cared. Especially when you have a religion that's dripping in polyamory and not too many weddings. Just people calling anyway. They want to tell you what constitutes living in sin. Okay, so his relations included a threesome with Ruth and Joe Barlow, who were philanthropists. He also lived with them in Paris for about 6 years. In January of 1808, he married Harriet Livingston, 1783 to 1826, who was 19 years younger than Robert. Tale as old as this country. Together they had 4 children. Robert, during the marriage, did propose a foursome with he, his wife, and the Barlows in the District of Columbia. Harriet declined. Harriet was not about that life, but that did not seem to stop her husband one bit. And that seemed to be quite rampant amongst philanthropists. This is why I say the story regarding buck breaking when it comes to white slave masters and the heads of plantations sexually violating Black men, I don't really believe that it had to do with breaking the spirit of Black men, because homosexual men and women have existed since time has existed and human beings have roamed the earth. I think they just found a new way of describing sexual assault because of their desires. Because when that Mandingo mentality was running about, there was not just one gender that was attracted to the mighty Mandingo myth surrounding Black men. I think it was just a cover story for when they were walked in upon. But let us continue. Wall Street and slavery. Bet you didn't think of that, huh? Before becoming a financial district, Wall Street was the first slave market in New York. It was funded by United States banks at the time and contributed heavily to the operation expansion of plantations. Slaves were used as collateral for mortgages. Also during this time, I call them slave Tupperware parties. People would have a handful of slaves that would be in the house, and they would invite their friends, have a cup of tea and some libations and a little food, and sell off slaves. Because in New York, you didn't need a whole plantation full of slaves. You just needed a few for the house, a few for the business, things like that. And then there were people, as we discussed last week, in the North and the South, that would get 1 to 5 slaves and then rent them out to other people. See, when slavery is whitewashed and revisioned, it's not just erasing Native history, Black history, Asian and Pacific history. It's also eliminating parts of white history as well. because they love to act as if slavery simply only existed in the South with all the good Southern belles and gentlemen. Banking and slavery. Commercial banks accepted slaves as collateral for loans and as a part of loans assigned over to them by third parties. Many banks helped underwrite the sale of slaves using slaves as collateral. This is why I said in the beginning why so many people were upset. Now, there are people who try to say that, oh no, the slaves were treated well. They were treated like family. And this is why they were so hurt when they escaped. No, they were losing their money. It would be like your stocks and bonds being stolen from you, your retirement being stolen from you. It's no more, no less than collateral. No more, no less than collateral. But as we go on this journey, as you learn more through Black literature and through the additional history that I'm giving you so that you have a full picture as you go through the book Black Fortunes, I want you to think of the conversations that you have had, the things that you have been taught, and the things that you see and you engage with today. But as always, thank you for joining me here. And each one teach one, each one reach one. Till next week.